Yeah, I'm just trying to look at perhaps if you can do that a little bit too, and yeah.
There's some more chairs up there. Okay, now that is so we're now broadcasting. So she should be able to.
Oh, yeah,
Oh, right. Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you very much for coming to this CCI Lunchtime Seminar series. As I'm sure you all know, the reason we're here is to listen to Rosie and Bryony from TPA and Traffic talking about a very important subject, certainly to CCI, but I think globally, the role of women, or at least women in constellation leadership, and how we can increase the number of women making a better contribution to our global applied university challenge. So it's something that is a real challenge in the CCI and indeed the broader conservation community. But it's great that the CCF happens to be doing this work. I'm going to hear all about it now. So, over to you.
Thank you. So I think you all agree that being more inclusive is going to lead to better outputs for many, many things. And of course, we're all interested in conservation. And I'm going to give you a background as to kind of reason why Women in Conservation Leadership Group started, and then Brian is going to tell you more about our strategy and the way that we're looking forward for conservation. But we're all biologists, so I thought we should start with biology. People often ask what is gender, but I thought it'd be more interesting to look at some birds. So here's a quick quiz then. So two of these birds are unusual because the males incubate the eggs. So we often think of gender as being a kind of something to do with societal norms, behaviour that women do versus men. We often think that most birds, it's the women, it's the girl birds who incubate the eggs. So which two? Which two? There's two of them. The first two?
Yeah.
Other answers?
I don't know so much.
Okay, random stuff is good, but okay, this one was correct.
Okay.
So what's the other one then? Excellent. Okay, so we've got some biology in, so I'm glad to see various bird watchers in the audience, so they're going to stay awake for the rest of the talk. And of course, there has been a lot of profile around gender and conservation in general. This was a recent announcement from the COP24. We're not actually going to talk about gender in conservation at all levels or all globally. We're going to focus on gender in conservation leadership. And particularly around our CCF Women in Leadership Group. Okay, so what do we mean by leaders? Well, this was the G20 meeting in 2018. So here's another quiz. How many women leaders are there in this photograph? Okay, how many should there have been in the photograph? 50%. Yeah. So we have as G20 leaders, so leaders of actual nations, there is actually only one, that's Theresa May, because this is Christine Lagarde from the International Monetary Fund. Angela Merkel is meant to be in the picture, but her plane broke down somewhere, so she didn't make it. It was rigged. It was rigged, yeah. But I think it's a very startling picture. I think particularly because of this very typical dress wear that people tend to wear. So typically, most men are wearing suits, so it does stand out, quite a lot, doesn't it? So let's move away from Theresa May. Talking about some leadership. In the UK Biosciences, how many professors do we think are women? This is a multiple choice, A, B, C, or D. Yeah. So essentially, we as an observation that we often make, does seem that at leadership positions, whether it's G20 or biosciences, does seem to be that there are more male leaders. Even at the senior lecturer level in biosciences, there's only around 21 to 25% are women. And people have often made this observation about this thing they call the little pipeline, that because it's kind of weird, isn't it? I mean, there's loads of women in this room. Many of you are leaders. All of you are potential leaders. So why is it? Why do we see this pattern? In other words, at the kind of early career level of bachelor's or master's, there are more women. And I don't know any of you, if you did biology degrees, I don't know if you share the same issue. Were there more women in your class? Yeah? Yeah. So there are more women in your class. And then it sort of starts narrowing a bit. And around PhD, this is from Canada. I know it differs a bit, that there are still more women. And then as you get further up the career ladder, you find that the women drop off and you have more men. And certainly when I was doing a PhD, which obviously wasn't very long ago, we all sort of said, well, you know, because there are more just around equal women and men, doing PhDs is going to change, isn't it? So when I did a PhD, there was only one female professor. But we knew it was going to change because you have all these people coming in the pipeline. But 20 years later, possibly more, there's still only one female professor. So it's not just the case that we felt if we sit back and do nothing, the numbers won't necessarily change, because there's some kind of dropping off going on. I thought I'd share a little bit about some numbers that we got recently from our early career applicants for TBA courses, and also to share that this isn't actually, it does differ depending on which region you're in. So these are people who applied. We had about 500 people applying for our TBA courses this year, so it's for master's level. And in Europe, we had 74% of females apply. The Southeast Asians was roughly 50-50. And for Africa, it was the opposite. So there were fewer women applying on our courses. And we've just recently done a CCI funded course for citizen science conservation managers. This was a much later career course. And here, 28% of the applicants were women. So there is a difference depending where you are. I just wanted to acknowledge that. So not just leadership, but I don't know if you saw this, there was an article recently about the gender pay gap, that companies of a certain size are now by law asked to actually declare what their pay is. And it showed that 8 in 10 UK firms pay men more than women. So what do we think about conservation then? Is there a pay gap in conservation? First of all, yes or no?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. How much?
20%?
10? 10. So if you go to the Office for National Statistics, and I don't really advise you do this because you'll just waste your whole day, but we just did it just now. And for full-time work in conservation, and it's conservation in the environment, it's quite broad. Women are paid 16% less than men. But go and Google it and have a play yourself. I thought this was interesting. Somehow then, this seems to translate to children. So it turns out that boys receive 20% more than girls in their pocket money. And this is going to be my last quiz of the day. What do they spend their pocket money on?
Candy.
Yeah, sweets. Very good. So it seems that there's some kind of, we seem to observe some inequality going on. And it's not just numbers. I mean, numbers aren't everything, are they? And I don't know about you, but there's often discussions about why this is. And sometimes it's really difficult to know, are they facts or are they alternative facts? What is going on? And that's something that we in our group were really interested in exploring. And there's a whole bunch of explanations that seem to kind of come out. And I'm actually not going to talk about that because Brian will touch on that a bit. But these are the kinds of at least categories of explanations that often come out. Obviously not that very often, but that is one that came out a few years ago. And one thing that we've been looking at is this idea of schemas, or some people call them stereotypes. In other words, because it just so happens that there really are more male leaders in the G20, for example, it can actually influence how we think. Or if you were as old as I am, and those were the books that you were reading, then you may well be just kind of conditioned to think there is a difference between men and women, even if there isn't. So it's not about being sexist, it's purely about just being conditioned to think there are differences. I thought this was a really interesting experiment where people were given photographs of men and women, and they were actually the same height, but they were looked at in pairs, and people consistently overestimated the height of the men and underestimated the height of the women. So this is something being objective, it isn't being sexist. This is just that men are actually usually taller than women. So people were just used to seeing that, so that's what they were using to make their judgment. But one of the problems is that perhaps we also might use that in our judgments on other things, for example, in leaders. And this was another experiment people did where they showed people a picture of people sitting around a table and asked them who is the leader in that picture. And essentially what happened was that women seated at the head of the table were identified as the leader only half the time. So in the other half of the time, people just chose a man who was just happened to be in the picture. And that was men and women doing the same thing. That was men and women making the same judgment. This was 2016 where I did genuinely wanted a cartoon of a scientist, so I Googled it and this is what I got. And I thought two things from this. One is the cartoonists themselves perhaps were thinking a scientist is usually a man, and also quite often a bit bonkers. This is interesting. This was a survey done with parents were asked what they would like their daughter or son to do as a job, as a career. And so there was interesting differences. So, for example, many more wanted their sons to be engineers than their daughters. Many more wanted their daughters to be teachers than their sons. So these kinds of schemas and kinds of differences in jobs can affect us. Now, it's not that they necessarily thought their daughters couldn't be engineers. Perhaps they thought it wasn't a suitable place because, as we know, engineering is very male-dominated. So these kinds of things seem to permeate a lot of our lives, and this is perhaps why we do get this situation where perhaps there is this subconscious bias or unconscious bias. So we don't know it's there. The people judging the height didn't know it's there. Perhaps this person writing these cartoons wasn't making any statement about whether the women were less or more able than men being scientists. It just, we have this unconscious bias. And importantly, this could influence how we evaluate others and also how we behave. So I've got two examples where people have looked at this kind of thing happening in evaluation. I'm talking about a lot of experiments. People love doing experiments on people, but this was a real life example here, where the US Symphony Orchestras noticed that most of their lead violins, the first violins, which is a really prestigious job, and you're leading the orchestra, were men. And every time they were hiring new people, they were hiring men. And so what they did was they switched to blind auditions. Now in something like violin, you can do that. So you just put a great big screen up and people play, and then you're purely judged on how you play. And so the symphony orchestras did this, and this led to more women being hired in about 30% of cases. So you were no longer using any of your subconscious bias of how you thought a man or woman would play the violin. This was an experiment, and this, I think, was the thing that really caught everyone's attention, I think particularly in the UK and amongst scientists, because it was a paper published, and obviously, if it's published, it must be true, right? So, and this was one of those classic experiments where people were given two CVs, identical CVs, one with a male name and one with a female name, and were asked, it was for a job in the faculty, it was American faculty, and it was for a sort of leadership position in a job, and they were asked two things. One is, which one would you hire and how much would you pay them? So these were identical CVs, and men were ranked higher than women, and the men were offered higher salaries, even though the only difference was the name. And this happened by both the male and female evaluators, and I think that something that really made me wake up, because it's really easy to, we all think we're not biased. We certainly probably all think we're not sexist or racist. I mean, all of these schemas apply to any other type of group. But it turns out that we are, whether we like it or not. So I found this really interesting. There's another thing that people often talk about is that this idea that that if women act as being particularly ambitious, or that they're often told they're being bossy, or they're less easy to work with, and so this has come out. People often say that people don't like this so-called status enhancing behaviour in women compared with men, and it's been several studies that show this. So in a particular situation, if women ask for a pay rise in an interview or a higher salary in an actual application for a job, then they're often seen as less horrible. They're seen as, well, that's a bit pushy, isn't it? And yet, when men do the same, they're not seen as being pushy. So there's quite a lot of evidence around that. But what's interesting about that is then that could well be influenced how this sort of the group that belongs to that stereotype might behave. Because this is the same whether it's in gender or in other areas. So in other words, if you are aware that you will be judged negatively by asking for this higher salary or for pushing for a higher promotion, then you might just not do it. So this is called stereotype threat. You feel threatened if you know that you're in that stereotype when you perform less well. This is a really interesting, Ali Johnston, who can't be here today, she's written a paper on this actually. And she went to she has lots of conferences. She went to a conference and noticed that in spite of the fact that 50% of the speakers were women, she noticed that only 20% of the questions were asked by women. And so she thought that was interesting, and she's actually written a paper on it. So again, she was asking, so why is that? Is it because women are less good at asking questions? Is it because there's some kind of stereotype threat, or is it just because they're not used to seeing that happening? So the final bias I was going to talk about was this thing called lack of fit bias, which leads on to all of this, which is if you don't see yourself in a particular position, it may just be that you don't particularly necessarily try or strive to get there. So there's been a lot of work done this in the STEM areas, science, engineering, because that's where typically there's more men than women in that career. And there's a whole bunch of studies, but I thought was really interesting, where science students and surgeons start being equally ambitious, but when they get to the third year, the ambition drops in the women. And it seems to be that they don't really fit in with the leadership role. And it's particularly in the medical profession, typically the surgeons are, obviously it's a high stress job. There's quite a lot of hierarchy. There's perhaps quite a lot of status enhancing behaviour. And this has been done in the police profession as well. And it turns out that women often say, well, I don't particularly want that job. It's not that they don't think they can do it, it's they don't see themselves in that job. So this all kind of ties up together. It all sort of comes in through the fact that we, at the moment, in STEM and perhaps in conservation leadership, at the leadership level, there are still more men than women, and it may just be that this influences us. I'm going to miss that. I thought I'd share this. There's a thing called the gender decoder for job adverts. So even job adverts wording might be influencing whether people apply or not. So if you want to play with this, I played with it for quite a few adverts, and I found they were all male oriented. And one of the problems is that many of the words being used in job adverts are seen as being ones that particularly describe the male categorization of a leadership position. However, I found out that when I did this, one of the words that's seen as being more male was leader. So I thought that was a bit of a problem. So I think there's and Brian's going to talk about this, I think it's just an institutional culture where I think things are changing massively, and I think I personally wouldn't actually use this gender decoder myself, because I don't think, do people here think that leader is a male word? No, right. So it may well be that this hasn't caught up with reality, but this is currently available. I know organisations who are using this. The British Ornithologists Union have been using it. They've been taking this really seriously, so they've been checking for their awards announcements and their job announcements, and they've been putting it through this. So maybe there's this cumulative impact, and I think there's lots of interactions going on around who actually applies for the jobs, for leadership jobs. Is it because they don't think there's a lack of fit? Who is in the jobs? Who receives awards? Who's being promoted? I think it's a complicated, interactive thing. But I do think one aspect that comes out of this is that it's just leading to a lack of critical mass, perhaps. And then perhaps this just provides some kind of unconscious justification for our behaviour or for the status quo. Or, maybe you think things really are changing more now, and that perhaps that in another few years this won't be the case. But all what we've been discussing is that we've been saying this for a lot of years. So something must now be changing for things to change. In other words, we've been saying for many years, we can just wait because there's enough women in the pipeline that things will be okay. People are more aware now, behaviour therefore is changing. And our feeling is that perhaps it is happening, but maybe not fast enough. So we actually do need to be more proactive. And partly, and this, this was before I hand on, this was a result of a study that the Laurie Edwards College did, where they looked at, they asked men and women in the workplace, what issues do you think would be most important for us to react to? And there's two things that this is women and this is men. There's two things that people thought were the top priority. One is they said that Women are judged more negatively when they behave in the same way as men. That was one of the top things by both men and women. And then the other one was men and women are evaluated differently. So they were seen as being the most important things in a workplace culture that's influencing them. And this was published this year. So it does seem that there are still areas that do need changing. And we kind of know that diversity does improve performance. You have a wider set of opinions. It allows you to think outside the box. You move away from the issue that you just do the same thing over and over again, even if it's already working. So we know diversity improves performance, and there's some evidence for that, mainly from the private sector. So we know it's a good thing to move towards. And this is why we started talking about what do we think the way forward is. So when do we see more signs like this? And that's really why we set up the Women in Leadership Group to explore the way forward. I'm going to hand over to Bryony. And then there's going to be loads of time for questions at the end.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm Bryony and I'm a Programme Officer with Traffic. But today I'm really here representing CCF's Women in Conservation Leadership Network, which is a group set up by CCF. So I'll explain a little bit more about this. Right, so just following on from the survey that Rosie presented by Murray Edwards College, one of the things that's really critical about gender equality is really culture in the workplace. So this survey, 74% of female employees said that their workplace culture makes it more challenging for women to advance their careers than men. So they really felt that it is a lot about workplaces and cultures. And that was something that actually a lot of men agreed with as well, 42%. So I'm going to just go through some results that came out of another survey, which was done by PricewaterhouseCoopers. This was done in 2018. So they surveyed over 3,000 professional women around the world. These women mainly they were all in the 28 to 40 age category. So that's the point where really you start to see this progression gap appearing between men and women. And the things that they found that were coming out of this survey were that women were more confident than ever in their own abilities. Career is very important to women. They feel that they have what they need to progress, but they feel that they're not getting the support, the environment, the workplace culture that they need to really support them in that transition. So they highlighted 3 essential elements that came out of the survey. One being that transparency and trust really matter. 58% of the women surveyed said that their employers needed to do more to provide greater transparency to improve career opportunities. That they really wanted to know, how does this work? How do I actually progress within this workplace? Other things that came out were need for strategic support and the issues and challenges around balancing life and work are still critical for women around the world. Okay, so on the transparency and trust issues, the women who were surveyed really said that they wanted to understand where do they stand, and they needed career development, support, and ways to know what are the benchmarks, how do they progress. So the recommendation is really that employers need to offer a very clear understanding of expectations. They need to be very open about discussing pay and progression, and that will help women to actually advocate, make their own case, and be able to trust the feedback that they get as well. And something else that came out was really that women are traditionally not self-promoters. They are more likely to expect to be approached for promotions, and they may not apply for roles unless they really think they meet all the criteria. This is not something that men do so much. They will go for an opportunity even if they don't think they have everything that they need. So this can put women at a disadvantage. And I think the things that came out of this were both that women do need to speak up a bit, to put themselves forward a bit more, but organisations also have a responsibility to recognise that that happens and actually help create the environment where they can have maybe a more structured approach to this and be able to advance as well. And this alone won't solve the issue. It has to go hand in hand with bias training and addressing other things why women might not progress. So on the strategic support, something else that really came out from the survey was the importance of formal and informal support networks, both in the workplace and outside of work. And something that they really raised is that women need men as role models and mentors as well as women. They won't get there without men also mentoring and supporting women to advance. And then on life, family care and work, this is still something that women around the world felt was a very important issue. And this includes women in developing countries, Africa, Asia, as well as the UK. I think the UK probably is a lot better place than many, but it's still quite tough here. So 42% of the women surveyed said that they were worried about the career effects of this. 48% of new mothers going back to work felt overlooked for new opportunities and projects. And 37% of people who had taken time out from work didn't take the full leave that they were permitted because they were worried about the pressure. And the thing that they really emphasised here was that employers need to be proactive, otherwise it's lose-lose. Women are waiting longer to have children, so they're already very skilled by the time they have them. If you lose women at that point, or they don't progress as fast as they should, then it's a loss to the employer as well to the women. And also that there are good practices, there are examples out there, maybe in conservation, not so much conservation, but other sectors as well. But these need to be really proactively shared. And the other thing that really came out was that this is not just a female issue, and it's not a career stage issue. A lot of people want to work flexibly, a lot of fathers want to take time out also to be more involved with their children. Flexible working is something that needs to be made more accessible and more acceptable to everyone who's in work. So that's just a little bit of scene setting on some of the things that we can and should do, some of the concerns of women and what we can maybe do to help overcome them. So I'll just talk a little bit about the Women in Conservation Leadership Network group. So this is a group that's been established by CCF in 2013 by a decision of the council. So at the moment we have more than 500 members on our newsletter and our Facebook group. So we have an active Facebook group where people can post and advertise events. It's a group that's really open to everyone. We have men as members as well, and really inclusive of trans, non-binary people. Wanted it to be a safe space to discuss the issue. So having different kinds of events and meetings where people feel they can be open, and to bring people together to have more of a collective voice to strengthen ideas and help push for some actions. The network has two main focus areas, both on institutional change and supporting evolution in workplace culture, and also personal empowerment, because it's also about women believing in themselves and actually being self-advocates with themselves forward. When we talk about leadership, we're really talking about leadership at all levels. So not just formal positions of leadership and authority, like the CEO role, but really at any level within an organisation, as an individual, and really about the style and how you have impact in conservation, not just your formal position. We have a steering group which is helping to develop strategy and ideas for the network, which is drawn from the membership and also open to anyone to join. So some of the things that have happened so far, back in 2013 and 2014, there were a lot of meetings around the founding of the network, bringing ideas up and seeing what people wanted to do and what would be useful. Around that time as well, there were also a series of workshops on institutional change and what barriers women felt were present in their organisations and how they could be overcome. And also exploring a few specific topics like mentoring. We've also had some more informal groups, discussion group around looking at books and films and just meeting informally in people's houses to have more of a social element to it as well. Several times we've celebrated International Women's Day. So you can see here, I think it was 2017, where we had a gender equity cake pile. So this was highlighting the pay gap in the UK, where we encouraged men to take slices of cake that were 18% smaller. Didn't quite work in practice, but we did have some good cakes, and that's fine. We've also had some specific training workshops, and people volunteered to lead them. So we had one on navigating organisational politics, another one on public speaking. That's something we're happy to do more. So that's been great, but the last couple of years we've really taken a step back to try and think a little bit more about how to develop the network and what we want to do with it. So in 2018 we expanded the steering group. There are about 4 of us who were active at that point, and we have actually added another 7 people since. Now we've lost another 2, so now we're on about 9. But that was through an open call for members. But actually, as it worked out, we have really good representation, not exactly representation, but we have people from the different CCI organisations. So we have someone from RSP, FFI, BirdLife, University, the CCI MPhil programme, Traffic, TBA. So actually it's quite a nice spread within CCI, and we have a couple of people from other CCF organisations as well. So that's been great. And then this year we've really tried to pin down a strategy, a vision for the network, and what are the main things that we want to do with it. So some of our goals. So it's a network that's trying to work to achieve gender equality and conservation, focusing on Cambridge, but we'd like to make whatever we can available globally and inspire people around the world. Trying to push for a professional culture that's inclusive. I think this is something that a lot of women have said that they don't always feel heard. Their voices are not being heard. We also wanted to explore broader interpretations of leadership. So often, if you think of a leader, you think maybe sort of an alpha sort of approach. That's not the only way that you can be a leader. There's different strategies and different ways of making an impact to be more recognised. Something that came out of that survey, progression and promotion strategies. What can we actually learn from surveys and from the evidence about what really does work for women and actually creates a structure in which they can progress well? And then on the personal empowerment side, the women feeling that they're really equipped with leadership skills, and women who feel positive and confident in progressing their careers, and that they're not going to face any barriers from combining career with family life or anything else. Okay, our actions, I'm going to just sort of skip through this because a little bit short on time and we wanted to have some discussion as well. But these actions are really in the 2 main focus areas. So institutional change, trying to catalyse action within the conservation community. So really try to work with organisations or just inspire them to look at this issue a little bit more, see what they're doing already, see whether they have an issue within their organisation, and then think about what they can do to overcome it. And there are plenty of examples from other sectors as well where equality assessments or pay equity reviews that maybe are not being brought in too much in conservation organisations yet, And something we've also published this year, we've done a tip sheet on gender balanced panels and encouraged people to make some specific actions around making workshops and panels and conferences gender balanced. And actually CCF really pushed that this year with the Rewilding conference, where they really tried very hard to get gender balance, and that was a great example and some lesson learned from it. And then on the other side, empowering and equipping women to do more with our networking and informal support. I think people have really enjoyed coming to some of these networking meetings and meeting other women and going to support that way. And we'd like to put on more training workshops or encourage organisations to do it themselves. But these are really just ideas at the moment, and actually what we really want is input, and then try and prioritise a few things or bring together what people and organisations are already doing. So in 2019, we'd like to encourage people to join in, men and women. Events are also open to men, and they can benefit from it as well. And I think a lot of things that would benefit women would also benefit men. That's perfectly fine, and also what we're looking for. We have a newsletter and a Facebook group that people are welcome to join. So far this year, we already had a workshop on confidence in public speaking, which some people from the building I think also attended. As I mentioned, we have this pledge that we're promoting, a tip sheet on conferences and panels. We've got this seminar, and there'll also be a session with the MPhil. And we're also planning a network social in the near future. And Kit Stoner, who's the CEO from Bat Conservation Trust, has agreed to be the speaker there, and she's going to talk about job shares, and particularly what it was like to do a job share as a CEO, which I think is a really interesting topic, and one that, I'm really interested to learn more about. Yeah, and then I just put on much more, because it's then over to everyone else. What do you think of this, and what would be useful? And Rose, do you need to come up with this one as well? So that's the end of the formal.
Yeah. I have a question, one question for each of you. The first, for Rosie, you talked about the Tropical Biology Association and the differences in women applying versus men depending on the world regions.
Yeah.
And it seems like there's a great opportunity here for to kind of expand this work, to encourage more equality. So many of the NGOs in CCI work around the globe and have opportunities to encourage women increasing applications and stepping up into more leadership positions in different regions of the world. Is that something that you're really working on? And then my question for you will be, even though you're focusing on all different kinds of leadership, I'm curious, there's often, you get a lot more women in middle management, and then suddenly in organizations, and then fewer women at CEO levels applying to conservation organizations. Is that something you're addressing, or is it even an issue of conservation? So those are my two questions.
Oh, fantastic! Yeah, it is really interesting. We have an office in Africa, and we work with a lot of our TVA alumni who are doing amazing. We're kind of being amazing role models for women. So I think from your question about in Africa, I think that pipeline thing happens very early on, and so what I find interesting is there is a cultural difference, and I think it's very much sort of. We've been holding some seminars around gender and conservation, but very much allowing them to lead it, because it is so different in the sense that in very traditional families, often it's the boys who are going to school earlier than the girls. So even to get to university level, there was a difference in numbers. So it's quite different from here, I think. It's obviously slowly changing, but it hasn't quite changed enough. But yeah, I think there's a lot we can do, but I think it's very much, I think people need to have the confidence to stand on a platform and talk about it. At the same time, I think the solutions are going to come from, just as we're trying to find solutions for our culture and our institutions and the conservation community here, I think the solutions will have to come from their community there. I mean, interestingly, last time we did something around gender, some of the men in the audience said that they felt that there's been too much work on the girl child and it was disadvantaging the boy children. So it is an interesting setup, but yeah, lots and lots to do, definitely.
So the other question was about whether women really in those top jobs is something that we're focused on and interested in. I think, yes, that is important, that's definitely a part of it. I don't know that our network as such can solve that problem. I mean, what we're trying to do is to help organisations or try to inspire organisations to look at this as an issue and trying to get that pool of talent sort of rising up as far as it can go. And I hope, all the way to CEO level. There, I think it is an issue in conservation organisations. I don't really have the data, but I mean, you still don't see that many women who are leading organisations. There are some, and I think a lot more than there were, even 5-10 years ago, but not so many.
So one of the things we talked about was for that aspect was to actually borrow from academia, which set up this thing called the Athena Swan Charter. That's something that we really wanted to do for NGOs. The Athena Swan Charter did the kind of thing that Brian had talked about on her earlier slides. In other words, looking at institutional culture, have you made it very obvious how the promotion works, how pay structure works? Have you made it easy for people to ask, whatever gender, whatever, wherever they're from, to ask for those promotions? And the Athena Swan Charter was something that is something that universities have signed up to, and it very much looks at the institutional culture. So it's all those things that Brian mentioned earlier, which is do you have pay assessments? Just as companies have actually recently, are you looking at your pay differentials or not? And people just weren't looking at them. And the Athena Swan Charter has a bronze, silver, and gold set up, and there are a series of things you can do in order to get them. And we felt it would be really useful for NGOs, and we wanted to, because the Athena Swan people had said they were interested in us working with them, and we couldn't do it on our own, and we were looking for funding for that. And I think it would make a huge difference, because it certainly has in many universities.
I think also when it comes to making appointments really at very senior levels, it's boards of organisations that also need to be.
Do you have any thoughts on how we can get around the problem of women in academia suffering career-wise when they have children? Because in academia we're so judged on publication record, and when you take time off to have kids, your publication record is likely to suffer. So that's one thing that I think about and struggle to see a solution to.
But quickly, because just on the Athena Swan, and then I'll hand to you. The Athena Swan Charter is something that has looked at that. So the idea is how to read a CV, and that to get away from the idea that when you read a CV, you just count the number of publications. So there are a few things that I know in academia, for example, that people are now looking at, but the point is people need to be kind of trained or made aware of it. And one was to read the CV and to allow for career breaks, and therefore relook at that CV rather than just going, oh well, this person's got fewer publications than that person. So there are attempts to do that, and I think it's possible that your generation is that first wave where it's going to really work. But that's just one aspect, and the other is things like, even being invited to give talks at very, very important conferences and so on. So I know that it's being looked at, and I think if you look at the Athena Swan has these sort of guidelines, and if people did actually looked at and adopted and internalised, I think it would make a big difference. Do you want to add to it? And then
I think I don't really know about academia specifically, and this is something I'm thinking a lot. I just took a break last year to have a baby and come back from that. And I think there are a lot of good examples out there of very specific things that can be done to help in that situation. Flexible working, but also looking at the role and making sure that you're still given stretch opportunities after taking a break, even if you're spending less time. If you cut some parts out of your job, can employers make sure it's not all the most interesting stuff that gets cut out? I don't know, there is no easy solution, but I think bringing together the examples that are there and also just encouraging men to also take the leave that a lot of them want to take, but still feel that they can't because they're also going to be penalised for it. I don't know, I mean, organisations have to do what they can.
Stu?
Two observations. I'm struck by the fact that there's about 60 or 70 people in this room and there's only about 5 votes. So I think you should run exactly the same session, but give it the title, How to be a Successful, Ambitious Conservation Leader, or something like that, and according to your studies, you'll get a much higher proportion of voters. And less flippantly, we were involved in a recent project funded by the EU, which involved recruiting 15 PhD students who were based at various universities around Europe and all the secondments to like ICF, WCMC, TEMSL. And the whole application process was anonymised. So the candidates were given very strict instructions as to how to make sure their CVs were anonymous. They all went to someone else who was then not involved in the interviews to check that they were properly anonymised. And a far higher proportion of the CVs from men were incorrectly anonymised and had to be sent back and told you've got a second chance for your business. So basically women followed the instructions, men were kind of arrogantly assuming I'm good enough, they'll interview me.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. But the outcome was about 50-50.
Thanks, and I think it's a really great way forward to anonymise applications. And in the past, people have said, oh, it's too difficult. But that's exactly the problem.
It did take a lot of time.
It does take more time. But again, if you don't do it, you're kind of reinforcing this thing that, well, the status quo, and some people actually thinking there isn't a problem. The best candidates will come, well, the best candidates ought to come out, but actually often they are men simply because of this subconscious bias, amongst other things. So I think that's a fantastic example, and I think one of the problems is it is more time, but if it's more time and you get ultimately your best candidates, then it's worth it, right? And then back to your comment about the reason we didn't put the advert in was because we're trying to move away from the idea that leaders have to be ambitious and aggressive. I know. But I like the idea. We may well try it. Yeah.
So I personally feel like a big problem with it is like the hierarchical structure in the organizations, job places, and everywhere, academia. Like I feel like as a woman that I don't like me myself as if I should go to high powered jobs because I want to spend more time with my family and that will demand more time for myself. So I have this question. Are you working like within CCF of maybe like changing that hierarchical structure in certain organizations, which is very challenging, but I think that's at the basis of a lot of this like gender bias. Like how are we still structured as like one CEO down to program officer thing that really doesn't work for most people, particularly women. So is there any approach, or do you know of organizations that are working on that or aren't?
I don't know, but I think it's something that would be great to explore more. Can we have more flatter structures that are not so much about this hierarchy? And also, can we get away from the idea that senior or leadership roles have to take a lot of time? Because they shouldn't. You should be able to do them within a normal working week. And actually, that's something that I have been struck from my own job. Actually, I work with a board of trustees, and some people are incredibly influential in very small amounts of time. So it doesn't have to mean that you have to spend every hour of the day working if you want to be in one of those positions. I think that might come back to this kind of lack of fit and not,
But it certainly relates to, as Bridie said, that with this the leadership group we're in, that we very much wanted to make a distinction between institutions and changing institutional culture, which is what you've just said, and empowering women, because we felt in the past people often said, oh, well, if only women could be more confident, then it would be all right. So it's changed the women's behaviour, or the men's, depending if they're in the thing, whoever. And actually, exactly that. It's something that, and it would be great if you came along to the next meeting and we can discuss it more, because I think it's going to, I mean, change happens very slowly, we know that. But the more we can do and the more we can lead the way. And I think CCI and CCF are brilliantly placed to make them, to really make a huge move on this and to be very influential. So yeah.
How can we use the power of CCI or being in this building to push our organisations to change? So it might be mandatory training for HR and anti-bias. It might be we all have to publish internally between our organisations gender pay gap statistics, because we're probably too small to reach the legal requirement. So I think some of us are pushing internally within our organisations, but maybe the power of the shame factor of having everyone in CCI doing it might actually bring about change.
It's brilliant, and I'll just mention it once more. That's why we really wanted to do it at an Athena Swan, because it was kind of the idea behind Athena Swan, which was kind of voluntary, so people had to sign up to it. Although interestingly, the Athena Swan, which was asking for those kinds of things, for example, training. If you go into an interview, you have to have training for subconscious bias. In the academic world, actually having an Athena Swan was linked to you getting money as well. So that was a very cunning way of people volunteering. I think within the CCI, we are a community, and I think I think we could do something, but I wouldn't do it with a shame factor. I'd say it'd be more sort of peer encouragement, and people would want to do it more. But maybe it's something we can talk about at CCI.
I think, it could be a coalition of the willing to start with, and then try to get more buy-in around it.
I just wondered whether the Athena Swan system, is that pushing for cultural and institutional change in what people need, in the kind of characteristics that people should have in order to be leaders, not just CEOs, but leaders at all levels? Or is it focusing more on the training and the other things that you talked about giving women more opportunities to just...
It's focusing on both.
Is it?
But for the one that we had, the vision we had for an NGO one would go further towards what Bryony just said in answer to your question about what do we think a leader should be.
Yeah.
But it certainly went more than just the training, and it was certainly more than just. Arguably one could argue it went further, or arguably some organisations got bronze maybe shouldn't have done yet. But it was based on what processes we put in place, and what changes you're making, as opposed to purely just how many female professors do you have. So there was, but it wasn't around specifically saying what do we think a leader should look like, but it was around a lot of the family-friendly practices and all that. So it was quite broad, but the idea would be to take their lessons learned, but to shape a new one that would fit NGOs, because NGOs are different.
I suppose my feeling is that the answer to this problem is that we actually, and the diversity problem more generally perhaps, is that we need to actually change what people want and think they need in leadership roles, because I think a lot of male and female leaders that we've got at the moment aren't terribly good. I'm not talking about the CCI community, I hasten to add specifically, but more generally. And that's society has kind of either let that happen or made it happen or whatever.
That's right. So I think
many leaders do work far too hard, they're far too stressed, they burn out. There's all sorts of things wrong with leadership in conservation and elsewhere.
So in our very first meeting we had, we said to everyone, what do you think a leader looks like? So that's what Brian just said. Well, Brian, it was all around. It wasn't around it wasn't around the more traditional what society has self-reinforced itself, perhaps, or people who might be really stressed or work all hours or are particularly or very ambitious or very authoritarian. It was all around having the impacts that you want to have, and particularly around it was around bringing other people with you. So that's exactly what we've been talking about. But as we've been saying, I think the Athena Swan is not the answer. There's a multitude of things you need at the same time. The Athena Swan would be a blunt, nice, friendly, blunt instrument to help speed things up a bit. Because it's certainly, my observation in the university was that if it hadn't been for Athena Swan, many departments would have said, we're fine. We don't have any bias. And I was on a committee of one of them that said, no, our last recruitment wasn't biased at all. And then they looked at the numbers and found that it was. So it wasn't that people were wanting to be biased. They just didn't believe it until they saw it in front of them. But exactly that. I mean, the whole institutional aspect, I think, is fascinating, and that's where I think everybody in this room would have loads of really interesting things to input into that. So perhaps we can have that as one of our next discussion meetings. You're all welcome.
To finish on because it's half past. So
Any last? Is there a last question?
Miss Lady.
You were
Sorry.
So this is probably more of a thinking point than a discussion point given the time. But I just thought I'd maybe offer an alternative explanation for the leaky pipeline, the point where everything starts crossing over and the gender ratio starts to change. So this is purely kind of based on my own observations, and I think academia works slightly differently to this, but just my own observations, I've noticed that a lot of people in supportive roles, this is kind of comes back to this gendered language thing, but when you say the word support, I feel that's typically associated with women, and most PAs, executive assistants, project assistants, I find that they're typically female. And as an early year conservationist, I've noticed that a lot of my male friends from degrees and things, they seem to they either end up in sort of more technical roles, or they just somehow manage to skip that point completely and just end up as a sort of product officer or as a product manager. And I kind of wonder how they manage to do that. But I do wonder whether if that kind of influences things, because if you're seen to be in a supportive role, that you're supporting someone else, you're supporting a team, is there a subconscious thing around, can this person think themselves compared to someone, who's in a more technical role, they get known as an expert for something, and I just wonder whether you thought maybe that might be influencing this sort of ultimate.
Yep.
Yeah, we definitely talked about that a lot. Sort of women going into more kind of communications or relationship management or assistant roles because they've been sort of pigeonholed in that way early on and not managed to kind of break out of it.
Yeah, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think it might be how leaders see. They're not necessarily skills that society at the moment thinks that a leader looks like. I don't think that.
And one final point. So for any women who have maybe daughters and they want to break down the stereotype of, men are usually scientists and women have to do whatever else, there's another woman named Brian Matthews who wrote a book called Broccoli and Nanobots, which is full of women of every type, and a lot of diversity as well, doing every kind of science things that I haven't even come across. And it shows you if you want to be an oceanographer, then these are some of the things you might be interested in, and it really gives a great perspective for kids, maybe primary school level, to just be to see that that's an option, and that was something I found very encouraging. This
Yeah. But thanks. Great.
Can you share it in the Facebook?
Yeah, I
Yeah,
can send the link.
Okay, I'm afraid we must stop because this room is used for something else, not as good as this, I'm sure. But, so let's all say an enormous thank you to Bryony and Rosie for this really great talk. And already a member, please join the CCF Women in Leadership role. Hang on just a sec. Sorry, group. And encourage everybody else to do the same, men and women alike from across the CCI community. Can I just remind you that there will not be another seminar in a fortnight's time because it's Bank Holiday Monday, but instead we've got two in the week beginning the 3rd of June. So it's the Sustainable Goals and Missing Opportunity for Conservation, Ms. Wilkinson on Monday the 3rd, and then there's a special one on Thursday the 6th of June, which is Natasha Ali and others from the CCI post-2020 task team, which are developing a post-2020 biodiversity framework, or at least looking at how the CPD is doing that and how we contribute to that CCI. So please come to both.
wanted to ask you, for my conservation initiative. I was wondering if there might be an
I'm sure there might be. Yeah, sure. I'll have to check with the group. But let me do that. Would you mind dropping me an email just to remind me to do that? And then I'll just send that to the it's area brands. Yes, it's on the CCI website.
Okay, I'll get it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, great.
Just say hi quickly.
Hi.
Coming, sequence one.
Yes.
Just want to say hi and then we can
Oh, great. Okay, so I dropped him an email after his.
Oh, okay.
Yes,
No,
I
I
haven't heard back from him, so I imagine he's busy.
yeah, he is always really best. You know, you'll be
Yes.
yes. So you need to plan that.
Yes. Yeah.
Show you around, you know, animals and.
No, that's great.
Yeah, so
Yeah. Well, that'd be really good. I mean,
Yeah.
how much time is he going to be here while you're here? Because he was hoping when he started, I think, to be here rather more than it was.
I know,
Is that right?
it's just really good, yeah.
Yeah.
I think, yeah,
So
he was in Milan.
Right, okay. Yeah.
and he flew back to Beijing just for a few days. He's coming back.
Okay. Yeah, hi.
Okay.